And I'd like to start out this morning with a bit of the proverbial watching the sausage being made, asking you to open your green hymnals to page 30, not hymn 30, but page 30 in the front part of your hymnal. Going back to these hymnals, we have the lectionary spelled out for us, and we are in the second to the last Sunday of the church year before Christ the King Sunday. And if you look at letter C, you'll see our readings for today. Isaiah 52 and Luke 19. All right, well, if you'll flip the page earlier to page 29, at the bottom, there's a little secret. This hymnal was published nearly 50 years ago, and it used an earlier version of the lectionary. Since 1994, our Lutheran denomination has been using the Revised Common Lectionary, which made some slight changes, and one of the biggest changes, I think, involves the last two Sundays after Pentecost. This week, our sister ELCA churches will be reading what's at the bottom of page 9, again looking at letter C, the third column. They'll be reading from Malachi 4, 2 Thessalonians 3, and Luke 21, 5 to 19. Now that is also known as the Little Apocalypse, because Jesus correctly prophesies about the destruction of the temple and the rest of Jerusalem. This second to the last Sunday in the lectionary cycle is always about how bad things happen in the human world. You notice that Jesus says in our gospel, they're still thinking that the kingdom of God is coming immediately. He's going to set us straight with a little apocalypse of our own. This year I went back to the Luke 19 text because I think it's the perfect little apocalypse for the theme of the dangers of wealth that we have been encountering. For 3 months now, we've been noticing, traveling through the middle part of Luke's gospel, that Jesus encounters 6 rich men. And 5 of these encounters are not in any of the other 3 Gospels. It's Luke alone who loads us up with these encounters with 6 rich men. And in various ways, through the first 5 encounters, Jesus has commented on the dangers of wealth, especially how it creates this great chasm between rich and poor. And that's against God's intentions for creation and for our mutual flourishing as God's children. Against the hoarding of riches by the wealthy, Jesus uses an indigenous wisdom to teach us God's gift economy based on sharing with others in gratitude rather than hoarding against others in greed. Finally, last week with the 6th encounter, we witnessed a rich man who does the right thing. Zacchaeus realizes the error of his ways and undergoes a conversion to not only generously sharing of his wealth, but also a very real dismantling of his wealth in order to make reparations, to right the wrongs of how he accumulated his wealth unjustly in the first place. Nothing less than salvation has come to his house, Jesus declares. But while they're still taking that in, This week, we descend back down to earth with Jesus very quickly in this little parable about a ruthless nobleman turned king who shows us the real world of empire that's still in play. And again, as Luke warns us, Jesus is fully aware that his launching of God's reign is not going to be an immediate thing in terms of the fullness of its impact. While Jesus is sitting there at table with Zacchaeus, he tells everyone this parable about the real world that continues, which will not yet be toppled just because Zacchaeus, a wealthy chief tax collector, has finally done the right thing. It's going to take a whole lot more Zacchaeuses to bring God's reign fully and completely into this world. And guess what? 2,000 years later, we still have quite a ways to go, don't we? Yet again, we have rich and powerful men on the ascent in our world who operate too much like that nobleman turned king in today's parable. Now, it's very easy to see his brutality at the end of the parable, where he slaughters everyone who's acted against him. One of Herod's sons, Archelaus, acted exactly like the king in this parable. I put a summary of that in your sermon notes. So the people there at Zacchaeus' house would have known exactly the kind of person that Jesus is talking about. Archelaus and so many others. This sort of king was all too common in their world, and unfortunately, it's still too common for us too, right? How many of our wealthy authoritarian leaders of today are all about making sure they punish their enemies? Yes, the brutality of the king in today's parable is still too easy for us to see in our world. Unfortunately, though, we've been somewhat blind to the cruelty of the earlier actions of the king in this parable. When the nobleman goes off to the emperor seeking to be made a local king, he leaves 10 pounds with 10 servants, one for each servant. When he returns and begins to make an accounting of what they've done with his money, the first servant proudly produces 10 pounds and the second 5. They've used his money to make more money in a relatively short amount of time. The drama of the accounting stops, though, with the third, right? Jesus doesn't bother to tell us about the other 7, presumably because his audience already knows Jesus' point. One of the worst things about wealthy people is that they make so much of their money by using it to make more money against the goodwill of other people. The third servant has sized up his master correctly and refused to play that game. He just wraps it up and gives it back to him. He knows the cruelty of how wealthy people take money by reaping what others sow. The most likely way that the first and second servant made so much of their money so fast was through something like loan sharking. They lent money to needy farmers at high interest, and when they couldn't pay, they were able to seize their assets. That's how things were done so often. And here's the thing, the poor people who followed Jesus, including his own disciples, knew this practice firsthand. It's what kept them poor. Zacchaeus also knew firsthand the cruelty of these practices because he had used them against others. It's the sort of thing for which Zacchaeus had needed to make reparations, to pay back fourfold of what he had defrauded from others. Jesus' parable reminds us that even though Zacchaeus' conversion is great news, there's still too many out there who still play the game. God's reign is not going to come immediately. The king in the parable doesn't even deny it. He simply punishes the servant who refuses to play the game by taking his pound away from him and giving it to the guy with 10. He sums up this cruelty of the imperial money game perfectly. Those who already have a lot get more. And to those who have little, theirs is taken away. Just a fancy way to say, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Now, I began to talk about this part of the king's actions by saying we tended to be blind to the cruelty of making money for money. The people sitting at Zacchaeus' table that day knew that cruelty firsthand, but in our capitalist society, where we've become increasingly focused on how to make money off of other people's money, this part of the parable has been applauded instead of booed in our telling of it. I have to confess that I've given sermons on this parable, especially Matthew's less violent version of it, praising the ingenuity of the first two servants. And being relatively blind to the fact that Jesus, from the viewpoint of this gift economy of God's reign, saw things the opposite. He saw the first two servants as playing the game of a harmful, unjust system, and the third servant as rightly refusing to play that game. So here's the thing. If we are to have our blindness healed, we have to also come to see that there are some of the basic principles of our economics which are unjust and harmful. That's not to say capitalism is all bad, that it can't be redeemed as Zacchaeus is redeemed, but it certainly has principles that lend itself to making money in harmful ways off other people's money. For example, has anyone here ever been squeezed till it hurts by credit card debt? One of the things that has helped me see things from a different perspective is to see Jesus and the story of his Jewish people from the perspective of indigenous people as people oppressed in someone else's empire. We see it all going all the way back to the prophet Isaiah and the empire of Assyria in our first reading today. So a book that's helped me is Choctaw Elder Steve Charleston's book, We Survived the End of the World. Insightful too, I think, in general, on this Sunday of the Little Apocalypse. The Jews underwent the end of their world, as Jesus prophesied they would. They didn't heed his prophecy to not get caught up in an attempt at violent overthrow of the Roman Empire. So 30 years later, they were crushed by the Romans and lost the promised land for nearly 2,000 years. The indigenous peoples of America have undergone a similar loss of their land. In We Survived the End of the World, Charleston offers the wisdom of several Native American prophets that we might learn to survive the crises that currently face us. In his chapter on an early 19th century Shawnee prophet, Tenskwatawa, he begins by recounting how Governor William Henry Harrison was carrying out Thomas Jefferson's plan to divest the indigenous people in the Midwest of their land, basically by loan sharking them. Sound familiar? I have Jefferson's actual letter detailing the plan to Harrison in your sermon notes. Tenskwatawa, on the other hand, was a Shawnee living in Ohio who had a vision of how their people could survive. They needed to double down on their basic moral principles, no matter what the white people did to them. Here's a quote from Charleston's account. Tenskwatawa's visions went on to reveal the ethical and moral precepts that should shape a believer's life. No more war or killing between native nations. Truth-telling in all negotiations. Respect for all women. Reverence for the earth and all her creatures. Above all, a deep communal sense of life and creation as gift. Private ownership of land was to be repudiated. No more land was to be ceded or sold. Native people should hold all things in common and share whatever they had with one another. Generosity was to be a cornerstone of the new faith as it restored ancient values and traditions. Well, Native Americans came from far and wide to visit the peace house that Tenskwatawa had established in his Ohio village. When white people threatened to destroy his peace house, called Prophetstown, he simply moved it to what now is a rather new state park near West Lafayette, Indiana, memorializing Tenskwatawa and his peace house. When white people did destroy the peace house there and moved his Shawnee people to Kansas, he simply established another peace house there where he lived until he died in 1836. Charleston writes, even after the destruction of the two predecessor villages, even after the loss of the war against the Americans, and even after the death of his brother, Tenskwatawa was defiant to the end. He carried his belief in his heart so that what he saw was that belief coming alive wherever he went. Therefore, Prophetstown was wherever Tenskwatawa was. The city on the hill was within him. Well, siblings in Christ, Luke was the gospel writer who also wrote the Acts of the Apostles, the sequel to his gospel. Even though he knew that the way of Rome and other empires would live on for quite a while, so would that new way of being human that Jesus brought into this world to live on. His followers would bring it with them wherever they lived in church communities. Notice in your sermon notes how close Tenskwatawa's moral principles for indigenous wisdom are to those that Luke describes in the book of Acts. I have a little quote there from Acts 4. Pretty similar. You and I continue to be the living embodiment of this wisdom based on gift and generosity. We repeat the basic actions of our founder every time we worship.
took bread, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to others. We live it through things like the community deal and thread by thread. And in a democracy, while we still have one, we have the opportunity to share with our fellow citizens this new way of being human based on giving thanks and generous sharing. Let's learn to share the new way of wisdom of this Peace House with our neighbors so that we can do more than just survive the next attempts at empire. Let us be part of bringing salvation to this American house in which we live. Amen.